On the evening of May 19, 1985, at approximately 11:47 p.m., FBI Special Agent Robert Hunter sat in an unmarked Chevrolet Caprice on a darkened country road outside Poolesville, Maryland, approximately 40 miles northwest of Washington, D.C. The night was clear and cool, with temperatures in the low 60s. Hunter, 39 years old, had been with the FBI's Washington field office for 12 years and had spent the last 7 working Soviet counterintelligence cases. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Special Agent Beverly Andrus, 34, who had been assigned to the same squad for 4 years. In the back seat, Special Agent Michael Chen, 31, monitored radio communications with other surveillance teams positioned at various points along routes 107 and 109. The agents were there because of a phone call that had been received at the FBI's Boston field office 15 days earlier. A call from a woman named Barbara Walker, who claimed that her ex-husband was a Soviet spy and had been passing classified information to the Russians for nearly 20 years. Before we continue with what happened that night, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these documented cases every week, bringing you the truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, back to that surveillance operation that would expose what the Secretary of Defense would call the most damaging spy ring in American history. The target of their surveillance that night was a 47-year-old retired Navy Chief Warrant Officer named John Anthony Walker, Jr., who was at that moment driving a rental car along Route 107, apparently heading toward a prearranged meeting location. What the FBI agents did not yet know was that they were about to uncover what would be described by Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger as the most damaging Soviet espionage ring in history, an operation that had compromised virtually every aspect of U.S. Navy communications and had potentially altered the strategic balance of the Cold War. This account is based on court records, FBI declassified documents, congressional testimony, and statements from participants. Certain operational details, including specific times and some agent identifications, have been reconstructed from multiple sources where exact information remains classified or unavailable in public records. All major facts, dates, locations, legal proceedings, and participant statements are verified through multiple documentary sources. The times recorded in surveillance logs represent agents' best estimates, where precise documentation was secondary to maintaining operational security. John Anthony Walker, Jr. had been born on July 28, 1937, in Scranton, Pennsylvania, to parents of Irish Catholic descent. His father, also named John Walker, had worked in various manual labor jobs throughout John Jr.'s childhood, struggling with alcoholism and providing an unstable home environment. His mother, Margaret Walker, had worked as a waitress and cleaning woman to help support the family. By all accounts from teachers and neighbors, young John had been an intelligent child, but restless and frequently in trouble for minor infractions, petty theft, truancy, fighting with other children. In 1955, at the age of 17, John Walker dropped out of high school and enlisted in the United States Navy. The Navy offered structure, purpose, and an escape from the limited opportunities of his Pennsylvania hometown. Walker was assigned to submarine duty and quickly demonstrated aptitude for radio communications and cryptographic work. In 1957, while stationed at a shore facility in Charleston, South Carolina, he met Barbara Crowley, a 19-year-old woman whose father was also in the Navy. They married in June 1957. Their first child, Margaret Ann, was born in 1958. 3 more children would follow, Cynthia Diane in 1960, Laura Ann in 1962, and Michael Lance in 1962. Throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Walker's Navy career progressed steadily. He received training in communications security and cryptographic systems, the codes and ciphers used to protect classified military communications. By 1967, Walker had achieved the rank of Chief Petty Officer and held a top-secret security clearance with access to what the Navy designated as sensitive compartmented information, the most highly classified materials in the U.S. military's classification system. He was assigned to the staff of the Submarine Force, Atlantic Fleet, headquartered in Norfolk, Virginia, where he served as a communications watch officer responsible for receiving, decrypting, and routing classified message traffic. The position gave Walker access to extraordinarily sensitive information. The materials that passed through his watch station included operational orders for submarine deployments, intelligence reports on Soviet naval activities, technical specifications for Navy communications systems, and, most critically, the daily key lists that were used to operate the KL-47 cryptographic machines that encrypted and decrypted top-secret naval communications. These key lists, printed materials that specified the rotor settings and encryption variables for each day, were the foundation of Navy communications security. Anyone possessing both the key lists and knowledge of how the KL-47 machines operated could decrypt virtually any classified Navy communication. Walker's life in Norfolk appeared unremarkable. The family lived in a modest house in a military neighborhood, managing on a chief petty officer's salary of approximately $800 per month. According to later interviews, the marriage was troubled. John drank heavily, stayed out late at bars frequented by Navy personnel, and offered vague explanations for his absences. Financial stress was constant despite his steady Navy income. It was in this context, financial pressure, marital discord, heavy drinking, and access to extraordinarily valuable classified information, that John Walker made his first contact with Soviet intelligence in December 1967. According to Walker's later accounts and declassified Soviet intelligence files, he walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. on a weekday afternoon in late 1967. He did not call ahead to make an appointment. He simply arrived at the embassy building at 1125 16th Street Northwest, approached the security window, and asked to speak with someone from the security office. After a brief wait, he was escorted to a private office where he met with a man who did not identify himself, but who Walker later understood to be a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover. Walker's proposition was straightforward. He had access to classified U.S. Navy communications materials and was willing to provide them to the Soviet Union in exchange for money. To prove his access, he had brought with him a package containing classified documents that included a recent key list for Navy cryptographic systems. Most sources suggest the initial payment Walker demanded was approximately $1,000, which in 1967 represented more than a month's salary. The Soviet officer, according to Walker's later testimony, showed immediate interest, but did not commit to anything during that first meeting. Instead, Walker was instructed to return to Norfolk and await contact. Approximately 2 weeks later, Walker received a phone call at his home from someone who identified himself only with a code phrase. Walker was instructed to travel to Washington on a specific date and to go to a particular location where he would meet a Soviet handler. This meeting established the operational relationship that would continue for the next 17 years. The Soviet intelligence officer who became Walker's primary handler was later identified through defector reports as Oleg Kalugin, a KGB major who specialized in recruiting American intelligence assets. Kalugin, 33 years old in 1967, had previously served in Washington under diplomatic cover and continued to run American assets through intermediaries. The operational system that was established for Walker followed standard Soviet intelligence tradecraft of the era. Walker would periodically collect classified materials from his work at the Submarine Force Communications Center: key lists, operational messages, intelligence summaries, technical manuals, and would photograph these materials using a Minox camera provided to him by his Soviet handlers. The Minox, a German-made miniature camera approximately the size of a cigarette lighter, was ideal for clandestine document photography. Walker would photograph the classified materials either at his home or, on some occasions, in his office when he was working night shifts and could be relatively certain of not being observed. The exposed film would then be delivered to the Soviets through dead drops, prearranged locations where Walker would leave materials to be picked up later by a Soviet courier, allowing Walker and his handler to avoid being seen together. The dead drop locations varied over the years, but typically involved sites in the Washington, D.C. area that could be accessed easily from major roads and that provided enough concealment for materials to be left and retrieved without observation. Common dead drop sites included parks, highway rest stops, and secluded areas near commercial developments. To signal that a dead drop had been loaded, that Walker had left materials to be picked up, and to receive confirmation that the materials had been successfully retrieved, Walker and his handlers used various signal systems. These included placing soft drink cans at specific locations along highways, arranging items in particular patterns, or making markings with chalk on utility poles or mailboxes. The exact signals used changed periodically as a security precaution. Payment for the materials was delivered to Walker through similar dead drop systems, or occasionally through more direct meetings in which Walker would drive to a prearranged location and rendezvous with a Soviet handler for a brief exchange. According to Walker's later statements and court records, he received varying amounts depending on the significance of the materials provided. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, Walker would receive somewhere between $750,000 and $1 million in cash payments from Soviet intelligence. Estimates vary based on different sources and Walker's own inconsistent accounts. For the first year of his espionage activity, from late 1967 through 1968, Walker worked alone, photographing materials himself and conducting all aspects of the operation independently. But by late 1968 or early 1969, Walker appears to have recognized both the limitations and the risks of operating as a lone agent. His access to classified materials, while significant, was limited to those materials that passed through his own duty station. The solution Walker devised was to recruit additional sources, other Navy personnel who had access to classified materials and who could provide him with a broader range of information. The first person Walker recruited was Senior Chief Radio Man Jerry Alfred Whitworth, whom Walker had met while both were serving in San Diego, California, in 1969. Jerry Whitworth had been born in 1939 in Muldrow, Oklahoma, and had joined the Navy in 1956 at age 17. Like Walker, Whitworth had specialized in communications and had risen through the enlisted ranks to senior positions with significant access to classified materials. According to later court testimony, Walker approached Whitworth sometime in 1970 with a proposal to provide classified materials to a foreign government in exchange for money. Walker did not initially identify the foreign government as the Soviet Union, instead describing it vaguely as an Eastern European country. Whitworth, according to his later testimony, was initially reluctant, but was swayed by Walker's argument that the information would not actually harm the United States, and by Walker's offer of substantial cash payments. The exact circumstances of this recruitment, where it occurred, exactly what was said, how Walker overcame Whitworth's objections, remains somewhat unclear as accounts from Walker and Whitworth differ in certain details. What is certain is that by 1971, Whitworth was actively providing classified materials to Walker, who was photographing them and passing them to Soviet intelligence. Whitworth's access, particularly when he was assigned to the aircraft carrier USS Constellation and later to other communications-sensitive positions, gave Walker's Soviet handlers information about Navy communications that extended far beyond what Walker himself could provide. The second person Walker recruited was his older brother, Arthur James Walker, who had joined the Navy in 1953 and had also specialized in communications work. Arthur Walker, born in 1934, was serving as a lieutenant commander in the Navy's Atlantic Submarine Force when John approached him with a recruitment pitch in the mid-1970s. According to Arthur's later testimony, John had told him that he was providing classified information to Israel, not to the Soviet Union, and had characterized it as helping an American ally. Arthur, who held moderate access to classified materials through his position, agreed to participate and provided John with classified documents on several occasions between 1976 and 1978. The third recruitment was that of Walker's own son, Michael Lance Walker, who had been born in 1962 and who followed his father into the Navy, enlisting in 1982 at age 20. Michael Walker was assigned to the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz as a yeoman third class, responsible for administrative and communications work. According to Michael's later testimony, his father approached him in late 1983 or early 1984, not long after Michael had received his security clearance and gained access to classified materials. John Walker told his son that he had been working for the Soviets for years, that it was lucrative, and that he wanted Michael to help him by providing classified documents from the Nimitz. Michael, according to his testimony, was shocked and disturbed by this revelation, but felt pressured by his father and believed he had no choice but to comply. He provided his father with classified materials on multiple occasions between early 1984 and May 1985. The recruitment of his own son was extraordinary, even by Cold War standards. It suggested either remarkable arrogance, a belief that family loyalty would override moral objections, or a fundamental misunderstanding of the psychological impact on a young man who idolized and trusted him. While Walker was building this espionage network within the Navy, his personal life in Norfolk continued to deteriorate. By the early 1970s, according to Barbara's later accounts, she had become aware that John was involved in something secretive and illegal, though she did not initially understand that it was espionage. She had observed him photographing documents late at night, had found unexplained large amounts of cash hidden in the house, had discovered the miniature camera, and had noticed his frequent unexplained trips to Washington and other cities. In 1976, John Walker retired from the Navy after 21 years of service. His retirement, which occurred when he was 38 years old, was earlier than typical for someone of his rank and experience. The reasons remain somewhat unclear. Some accounts suggest he feared becoming too visible, while others indicate his drinking and personal behavior had damaged his prospects for promotion. Regardless, his retirement presented a significant challenge for his espionage operation, as he would no longer have direct access to classified materials. Walker's solution was twofold. First, he maintained his recruiting network, Whitworth and Arthur Walker continued to have access to classified materials and continued to provide them to him. Second, Walker established a private detective agency in Norfolk as a cover for his activities and as a legitimate source of income. The detective agency did conduct some actual detective work, primarily serving legal documents and conducting background investigations, but it primarily served as a cover that explained Walker's income and his frequent travel. The marriage to Barbara finally ended in divorce in 1976, the same year Walker retired from the Navy. The divorce was acrimonious. Barbara received custody of the children, though by that time the older daughters were already adults. According to court records, the divorce settlement provided Barbara with minimal financial support, as Walker claimed limited income from his detective agency. In reality, Walker's income from Soviet intelligence continued substantially, far more than his Navy pension or his detective agency earnings. The period from 1976 to 1985 saw Walker continuing his espionage activities. He maintained his network of sources, conducted regular dead drops in the Washington area, and lived a lifestyle that included expensive cars, a yacht, an airplane, investments in real estate, and frequent travel to the Caribbean and other vacation destinations. Those who knew him, neighbors, casual acquaintances, business associates, generally believed he was a successful private detective who had made good investments. What remained hidden was the extraordinary damage his espionage was causing to U.S. national security. The materials Walker and his network were providing to Soviet intelligence included not only current key lists and operational messages, but also technical information about Navy communications systems, details about submarine operating procedures, intelligence reports on Soviet naval activities, and information about Navy war plans and strategic doctrine. Soviet intelligence analysts working in facilities outside Moscow were able to decrypt historical U.S. Navy message traffic going back years, gaining insights into American naval operations, strategic thinking, intelligence gathering methods, and military capabilities. The impact of this compromise on the Cold War naval balance was profound. Soviet submarine commanders, equipped with decrypted U.S. communications, gained understanding of American submarine detection methods and could adjust their tactics accordingly. Soviet naval planners gained insights into U.S. Navy deployment patterns, allowing them to position their forces more effectively. Most critically, the compromise of U.S. communications security forced a fundamental reassessment of how secure American military leaders believed their communications to be, creating uncertainty about whether operational plans and orders were being read by the adversary. Barbara Walker, living in Maine, where she had relocated after the divorce, spent the years from 1976 to 1985 struggling with financial difficulties and with knowledge that weighed on her conscience. She knew, or strongly suspected, that John had been involved in espionage during their marriage. She had witnessed the document photography, found the camera, discovered the unexplained cache. After the divorce, she had limited contact with John, but remained aware through her children that he appeared to be living well financially, despite claiming poverty during the divorce proceedings. According to Barbara's later accounts, she wrestled for years with the question of whether to report her suspicions to authorities. She was deterred by multiple factors: concern about how reporting her ex-husband might affect their children, fear that she might herself be implicated or accused of having known about his activities and failing to report them earlier, uncertainty about whether her suspicions were correct, and residual feelings that made it difficult to actively harm the father of her children. For nearly a decade after the divorce, she maintained this painful silence, watching from a distance as John appeared to prosper while she struggled financially. The catalyst that finally broke through her reluctance occurred in early May 1985, when her daughter Laura told her that she had witnessed Michael, Barbara's son, providing classified documents to John. Laura Walker had visited her father's house and had seen Michael there with his father, and had overheard conversations that suggested Michael was involved in something secretive involving Navy documents. When Laura told her mother about this, Barbara was horrified. The thought that John had recruited their son into espionage, that Michael was now at risk of prosecution and imprisonment, overcame all of her previous reluctance to report her suspicions. On May 4, 1985, in mid-afternoon, Barbara Walker stood at a payphone near her home in Maine, a handful of coins in one hand and a piece of paper with the FBI's number in the other. She called the FBI's Boston field office. According to the FBI agent who took the call, Barbara's voice was shaking when she first spoke. She initially seemed uncertain how to begin. There were several seconds of silence after the agent answered, before she finally asked whether she could provide information about someone who might be spying for a foreign country. The agent, recognizing this as potentially significant, transferred the call to an agent in the Soviet counterintelligence squad. The agent would later note in his report that the caller had clearly been crying. Barbara told the agent that her ex-husband, John Walker, had been providing classified Navy information to the Soviet Union for years, that she had known about it during their marriage but had been afraid to report it, and that she believed he had recently recruited their son Michael into the operation. The information Barbara provided was detailed enough to be credible. She described the miniature camera, the document photography, the unexplained cache, the frequent trips to Washington, and most significantly, she provided the name John Anthony Walker, Jr., and his current address in Norfolk, Virginia. The FBI agent took extensive notes and informed Barbara that the information would be forwarded to the FBI's Washington field office and that someone would likely contact her for a more detailed interview. The information reached the Washington field office's Soviet counterintelligence squad within hours. Agents began a preliminary assessment of Barbara Walker's claims. The FBI had received false reports of espionage before, angry ex-spouses making accusations that turned out to be groundless. However, certain details in Barbara's account, particularly the mention of the specialized camera and the description of document photography, suggested someone with direct knowledge of intelligence tradecraft. FBI agents authorized preliminary inquiries. Within 2 days, these initial investigations had produced information that was consistent with Barbara Walker's allegations. John Walker lived well beyond what his stated income from his detective agency could support. He traveled frequently and often internationally, and several acquaintances mentioned that he sometimes made cryptic references to other business ventures that were never clearly explained. On May 7, 1985, FBI headquarters authorized a full counterintelligence investigation, codenamed Windflyer. The investigation had multiple components: surveillance of John Walker to document his activities and contacts, financial investigation to trace his income and assets, interviews with Barbara Walker to obtain more detailed information, and background investigations into other individuals who might be part of Walker's network. Barbara Walker was interviewed extensively on May 10 and 11, 1985, by FBI agents at a hotel in Buffalo, New York, where she had agreed to meet them. According to FBI reports, Barbara was cooperative, but was also clearly anxious and frightened about the implications of what she was revealing. She provided agents with a detailed chronology of what she had observed during her marriage: the approximate date when John had first started photographing documents, which she recalled as sometime in late 1967, descriptions of the camera and other equipment she had seen, accounts of John's frequent trips to Washington and his explanations for those trips, and most critically, her account of a conversation in which John had admitted to her that he was providing information to the Soviets. This conversation had occurred in 1976, shortly before their divorce. According to Barbara's account, she had confronted John about the document photography and the cache she had found, and John had admitted that he was working for Soviet intelligence. He had attempted to justify it by claiming that the information he was providing was not really harmful to the United States, that it actually helped prevent war by allowing the Soviets to understand American capabilities, and that the money he was being paid allowed him to provide for their family in ways his Navy salary never could. Barbara told FBI investigators that she had been horrified but also intimidated and unsure what to do, and that John had implied that if she reported him, she herself might be prosecuted for having known about his activities and remaining silent. Armed with this information, FBI surveillance of John Walker intensified. Beginning on May 13, 1985, rotating teams of FBI agents maintained near-constant surveillance of Walker's residence in Norfolk, his detective agency office, and his movements throughout the city. They documented his daily routines, his business meetings, his social activities, and any unusual behavior that might suggest espionage activity. For the first several days, Walker's activities appeared mundane. He went to his office, met with clients regarding detective work, went to restaurants for lunch and dinner, went to a boatyard where he kept a yacht, and returned home in the evenings. Then, on the evening of May 19, 1985, surveillance agents observed behavior that appeared significant. In late afternoon, Walker left his office carrying a briefcase and drove to a rental car agency where he rented a two-door sedan. He returned to his office briefly, then drove to his residence. In early evening, he emerged from his residence carrying the briefcase and what appeared to be a bag. He placed both items in the trunk of the rental car. FBI agents photographed these actions with telephoto lenses from concealed positions. Walker then drove from Norfolk toward Washington, D.C., a journey of approximately 200 miles that took nearly 4 hours. FBI surveillance vehicles followed at intervals, maintaining visual contact while attempting to avoid detection. Walker drove north on Interstate 64, then onto Interstate 95, heading toward the capital. Late that evening, Walker exited Interstate 95, near Waldorf, Maryland, south of Washington. He drove on surface roads for approximately 15 minutes, eventually turning onto Route 301, heading north. FBI agents, maintaining position behind him, radioed ahead to other teams to position themselves along possible routes Walker might take. Near midnight, Walker turned onto Route 107, a two-lane rural road outside Poolesville, Maryland. The area was agricultural, with scattered houses and virtually no traffic at that time of night. Walker drove approximately 3 miles on Route 107, then turned onto Elgin Road, an even more isolated road that ran past farmland and wooded areas. FBI surveillance vehicles followed at extended distances, using night vision equipment to maintain visual contact while staying far enough back to avoid alerting Walker. Shortly before midnight, Walker stopped his vehicle at a point where a utility pole stood near a grove of trees. According to surveillance logs, Walker exited his vehicle, walked to the area near the utility pole, appeared to place something on the ground near the pole, returned to his vehicle, and drove away. FBI agents, maintaining surveillance, did not immediately approach the site, but instead continued to follow Walker. He drove back toward Route 107, eventually parking at a 7-Eleven convenience store approximately 2 miles from where he had stopped. He went inside, purchased what appeared to be a soft drink, and returned to his vehicle. While Walker was at the convenience store, other FBI agents approached the site where he had stopped near the utility pole. Using flashlights, they located a plastic garbage bag that had been left near the base of the pole. The bag contained what appeared to be documents. The agents photographed the bag in place, then carefully opened it. Inside were approximately 129 classified documents bearing markings indicating they were from U.S. Navy communications systems, including what appeared to be key lists and technical specifications. This was physical evidence of espionage in progress. Walker had just executed a textbook dead drop. FBI agents immediately established surveillance positions around the area, hoping to observe who came to retrieve the materials. In the early morning hours of May 20th, 1985, a vehicle approached the dead drop site on Elgin Road. The vehicle was a four-door sedan registered to the Soviet Embassy in Washington. As it slowed near the utility pole where Walker had left the materials, FBI agents, who had been positioned in concealed locations nearby, activated their vehicle lights and blocked the road, preventing the Soviet vehicle from leaving the area. Inside the Soviet vehicle was a man who identified himself as a third secretary at the Soviet Embassy. His exact identity was not disclosed in public court documents, though his diplomatic credentials were verified. FBI agents informed him that he was suspected of engaging in espionage activities and that they needed to search his vehicle. The diplomat, citing diplomatic immunity, refused to consent to a search and refused to answer questions. FBI agents documented his presence at the location, but under international diplomatic protocols could not arrest him or forcibly search his vehicle. The diplomat was eventually allowed to leave. Though his diplomatic career in the United States was effectively over, he would be declared persona non grata and expelled from the country within days. The FBI's attention now returned to John Walker. He had left the convenience store and was driving back toward Norfolk. In the early morning hours on Interstate 95 near Fredericksburg, Virginia, FBI agents in marked vehicles stopped Walker's rental car, approaching with weapons drawn as they would with any potentially dangerous suspect. Walker, according to FBI reports, appeared shocked when agents surrounded his vehicle. He was ordered to exit the car and was placed in handcuffs. The senior FBI agent present read Walker his Miranda rights. When asked if he understood these rights, Walker replied that he did. When asked if he wished to speak with agents, Walker initially stated he wanted a lawyer, but then, apparently reconsidering, asked what they wanted to know. Walker was transported to the FBI's Washington field office, arriving in the early morning hours of May 20th, 1985. The building was largely empty at that hour, the fluorescent-lit corridors quiet, except for the footsteps of agents escorting their prisoner. In an interrogation room on the fourth floor, with multiple agents present and with a tape recorder documenting the conversation, Walker was advised again of his rights. This time, he waived his right to an attorney and agreed to answer questions. The interrogation, which lasted approximately 6 hours with brief breaks, produced a confession that stunned even experienced counterintelligence agents who had investigated numerous espionage cases. Walker admitted that he had been providing classified information to Soviet intelligence since December 1967, nearly 18 years. He admitted that he had recruited Jerry Whitworth, his brother Arthur Walker, and his son Michael into the espionage operation. He provided detailed descriptions of his operational methods, his Soviet handlers, his dead drop locations, and the types of materials he had provided. When asked why he had done it, Walker's answers were revealing in their banality. He acknowledged that money had been the primary motivation. He had wanted a lifestyle he could not afford on a Navy salary. He expressed some degree of political rationalization, claiming that the information he had provided had actually made the world safer by reducing the chance of misunderstanding between the superpowers. But when pressed on this point by agents, he admitted that this was largely self-serving justification, and that money had been the real driver of his decisions. When pressed by agents to quantify what his betrayal had actually purchased, what his country's secrets had been worth to him in practical terms, Walker appeared genuinely unable to articulate it. According to interrogation transcripts, agents confronted him with the specifics: the yacht he rarely used, the airplane he had sold at a loss, real estate investments that had underperformed, trips to the Caribbean that were pleasant but unremarkable. When one agent asked him directly whether it had been worth it, Walker was silent for nearly a minute before responding that he did not know. Perhaps most disturbing to the FBI agents conducting the interrogation was Walker's apparent lack of remorse about having recruited his own son into espionage. When asked how he could have done such a thing, Walker responded that he had believed Michael would be fine, that the operation was secure, and that the money would help Michael financially. The agents noted in their reports that Walker appeared genuinely unable to grasp that he had not recruited an asset. He had destroyed his son. Based on Walker's confession and the evidence obtained during the surveillance operation, the FBI moved quickly to arrest the other members of the espionage ring. On May 22, 1985, FBI agents arrested Jerry Whitworth at his home in Davis, California, where he was living in retirement after leaving the Navy in 1983. Whitworth initially denied any involvement in espionage, but, confronted with specific evidence provided by Walker, eventually admitted that he had provided classified materials to Walker for approximately 15 years and had been paid approximately $332,000 for these materials. On May 28, 1985, FBI agents arrested Arthur Walker at his home in Virginia Beach, Virginia, where he was living in retirement from the Navy. Arthur Walker admitted to providing classified documents to his brother on multiple occasions between 1976 and 1978, but claimed he had believed he was providing the information to Israel, not to the Soviet Union. FBI investigators were skeptical of this claim, noting that the distinction seemed unlikely to have been maintained over such an extended period, but Arthur maintained this version of events throughout his subsequent legal proceedings. Michael Walker was serving aboard the USS Nimitz, stationed in the Pacific, when Naval Investigative Service agents came for him on May 22, 1985. According to later accounts from personnel who witnessed the arrest, Michael appeared confused when first approached. He had not been informed of his father's arrest 2 days earlier and initially believed he was being called in for routine questioning. When agents informed him that his father had confessed and had implicated Michael in the espionage operation, Michael's composure collapsed. He broke down, weeping, and within minutes had confessed to having provided classified documents to his father beginning in early 1984. In his statement to investigators, Michael expressed profound regret and stated repeatedly that he had felt pressured by his father, that he had trusted his father's assurances that the operation was secure, and that he had not understood the full implications of what he was doing. Several witnesses reported that Michael kept asking whether his mother knew, whether Barbara had known that his father had recruited him into espionage. The arrests of the Walker spy ring made front-page news across the United States. Major newspapers, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, ran detailed stories describing the scope of the espionage operation and the damage it had caused to U.S. national security. Secretary of the Navy John Lehman stated that the compromise of Navy communications had been devastating and had undermined the Navy's ability to operate securely. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, in a statement to Congress, described the Walker ring as potentially the most damaging Soviet espionage ring in history. The damage assessment conducted by the Navy and the National Security Agency in the months following the arrests concluded that Walker and his network had compromised virtually every aspect of Navy communications security over an 18-year period. According to estimates presented in congressional testimony, Soviet intelligence had potentially gained access to more than 1 million classified messages. They had obtained key lists that allowed them to decrypt historical message traffic going back years. They had gained understanding of Navy cryptographic systems that had compromised not only current communications, but also future systems that were based on similar principles. The assessment concluded that the damage to U.S. naval security was so extensive that it required a fundamental overhaul of Navy communications procedures, including the development and deployment of new cryptographic systems, changes to operational procedures to limit reliance on communications that might have been compromised, and enhanced security screening and monitoring of personnel with access to classified communications materials. The legal proceedings against the members of the Walker spy ring began in the fall of 1985 and continued through 1986. The cases were prosecuted in federal district court by attorneys from the Department of Justice's Internal Security Section, which specialized in espionage cases. John Walker, facing overwhelming evidence, including his own recorded confession, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a recommended sentence that would spare his son Michael from the most severe penalties. Under the plea agreement reached in October 1985, John Walker pleaded guilty to espionage charges and agreed to cooperate fully with government debriefings about his espionage activities, his Soviet contacts, and his operational methods. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to recommend a life sentence for Walker rather than seeking the death penalty, and agreed to recommend a reduced sentence for Michael Walker. On November 6, 1985, in U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland, John Walker formally pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage and to communicating classified information to a foreign government. Judge Alexander Harvey II, presiding over the case, accepted the guilty plea and scheduled sentencing for later that year. Jerry Whitworth, unlike Walker, chose to go to trial. His trial began in March 1986 in U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California. The trial lasted approximately 2 months and featured dramatic testimony from John Walker, who appeared as a prosecution witness against his former accomplice. Walker testified in detail about how he had recruited Whitworth, how the operation had functioned, and what materials Whitworth had provided. The jury, after deliberating for approximately 3 days, convicted Whitworth on all counts of espionage and conspiracy on August 9, 1986. Arthur Walker, like his brother John, pleaded guilty rather than going to trial. In August 1985, he entered a guilty plea to conspiracy to commit espionage and was sentenced to 3 life terms in prison, though the judge recommended parole eligibility after 10 years, given Arthur's more limited role in the conspiracy. Michael Walker, benefiting from the plea agreement his father had negotiated, pleaded guilty to espionage charges in December 1985. During his sentencing hearing, Michael's attorneys emphasized his youth. He had been only 22 years old when recruited by his father, his limited role in the conspiracy, and his expressed remorse. The prosecution, honoring the plea agreement, recommended a sentence of 25 years. Judge Harvey, while acknowledging Michael's relative youth and his father's manipulative role, emphasized the seriousness of espionage and the damage that had been caused to national security. On February 12, 1986, Michael Walker was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. John Walker's sentencing occurred on November 6, 1985. During the sentencing hearing, prosecutors detailed the scope of his espionage and the damage it had caused. They presented testimony from Navy and intelligence officials describing how Walker's activities had compromised U.S. naval operations and had potentially altered the strategic balance of the Cold War. Defense attorneys argued that Walker's cooperation warranted leniency and that his expressed remorse should be considered. Judge Harvey, in his sentencing remarks, acknowledged Walker's cooperation, but emphasized that the severity and duration of his espionage warranted maximum punishment. He noted that Walker had betrayed his oath as a Navy officer, had compromised the security of his fellow service members, had recruited his own family members into espionage, and had done so primarily for financial gain over a period of nearly 2 decades. On November 6, 1985, John Walker was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Jerry Whitworth's sentencing occurred in September 1986, following his conviction at trial. Judge John Vukasin, noting that Whitworth had chosen to contest the charges rather than cooperate and emphasizing the extensive damage his espionage had caused, sentenced Whitworth to 365 years in prison and a fine of $410,000, one of the most severe espionage sentences in U.S. history up to that point. While judges handed down sentences and prison doors closed on the convicted conspirators, the true reckoning for the Walker case was only beginning, particularly for the family members who bore no legal guilt but would carry the burden of these crimes for decades. The immediate aftermath was felt most acutely by the family members who had not been involved in the espionage. Barbara Walker, who had ultimately provided the information that led to the arrests, struggled with conflicting emotions about having reported her ex-husband and son to the FBI. Even though she knew her actions had been necessary, she gave only one public interview to a reporter from the Washington Post in 1986, in which she said that she regretted waiting as long as she had to report John, that she wished she had done so years earlier, and that she hoped Michael would somehow be able to rebuild his life after prison. The Walker daughters, Margaret, Cynthia, and Laura, faced the trauma of having their father, uncle, and brother all imprisoned for espionage, and of having their family name associated with one of the most damaging spy cases in American history. According to later accounts from friends and acquaintances, all 3 daughters struggled with depression, shame, and anger in the years following the arrests. They largely avoided media attention and attempted to rebuild their lives away from public scrutiny. For the U.S. Navy, the Walker case prompted fundamental changes in how security was managed for personnel with access to classified communications. The Navy implemented enhanced background checks, including more frequent and thorough investigations of personnel with security clearances. They developed systems for more closely monitoring access to classified materials, including logging systems that tracked who accessed which materials and when. They accelerated development of new cryptographic systems that would not be vulnerable to the types of compromises Walker had effected. And they instituted training programs focused on recognizing indicators of insider threats and on reporting suspicious behavior. The broader intelligence community also learned lessons from the Walker case. The Defense Department, the CIA, and other agencies implemented enhanced security procedures. They developed more sophisticated methods for detecting unusual patterns in how personnel accessed classified materials, and they invested in technology systems that would make it more difficult for insiders to exfiltrate large volumes of classified information without detection. John Walker was initially incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, a maximum security facility According to prison officials and later accounts from fellow inmates, Walker adapted relatively well to prison life. He worked in the prison library, took correspondence courses, and maintained contact with some of his daughters through letters and occasional visits. Notably, he never expressed public remorse for his espionage activities. In a 1988 interview with a researcher studying espionage cases, Walker stated that he believed his actions had been rational given his circumstances, that he did not regret having provided information to the Soviets, but that he did regret the impact his arrest had had on his son Michael. This lack of remorse, combined with his apparent inability to comprehend the moral dimensions of his betrayal, struck many observers as indicative of a profound moral deficit. Walker seemed unable or unwilling to grasp that he had not merely broken laws, but had betrayed trust, endangered lives, and damaged institutions. His focus remained on the practical and financial aspects of his choices, not on their ethical implications. Jerry Whitworth served his sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Terminal Island, California, and later at other federal facilities. Unlike Walker, Whitworth did express remorse for his actions, particularly in the years after his conviction. In a 1992 letter to a researcher, Whitworth wrote that he had made terrible mistakes and that he wished he had refused Walker's recruitment. He acknowledged that no amount of remorse could undo the damage he had caused, but he hoped that his case might serve as a warning to others who might be tempted by money to betray their country. Whitworth died in federal prison on July 21, 2021, at the age of 83, having served 35 years of his sentence. Arthur Walker was released on parole in 2000 after serving 15 years of his 3 concurrent life sentences. He maintained a low profile after his release, living quietly in North Carolina and avoiding media attention. He died on July 6, 2014, at age 79. In later years, he gave only one interview to a local newspaper in 2010, in which he maintained that he had believed he was providing information to Israel and expressed regret for having trusted his brother. Michael Walker served 18 years of his 25-year sentence and was released on parole in February 2000 at age 37. Upon his release, he faced the challenge of rebuilding a life that had been defined by his father's manipulation and his own poor choices. According to accounts from parole officials, Michael struggled initially with employment. Potential employers were reluctant to hire someone with an espionage conviction, and with relationships. He eventually found work in construction and later as a tradesman, and he married in 2005. In a 2007 interview with a documentary filmmaker, Michael described his years in prison as having given him time to understand the full extent of what his father had done, not just to the Navy, but to their family. He expressed anger at his father for having recruited him, sadness about the lost years of his life, and a determination to live the rest of his life in a way that would honor the trust that had been violated. When his father died in 2014, Michael did not attend the funeral. According to later accounts, when asked by an acquaintance whether he planned to visit his father's grave, Michael reportedly declined. The permanent rupture between father and son remained complete until the end. John Walker died in federal prison on August 28, 2014, at age 77. He had been incarcerated for 29 years. His death was attributed to natural causes. According to prison officials, Walker had been in declining health for several years prior to his death. None of his children attended his funeral, which was held at a small cemetery in Pennsylvania, and was attended by only a few people who had known him in prison. The question of exactly how much damage Walker's espionage caused to U.S. national security remains a matter of debate among intelligence professionals and historians. The immediate damage, the compromise of specific communications, the loss of operational security for particular missions, the advantage given to Soviet naval forces was clear and substantial. The longer-term strategic impact is more difficult to quantify. Did Walker's espionage alter the outcome of any specific Cold War confrontations? Did it affect the decisions made by U.S. or Soviet leaders during critical moments? Did it change the trajectory of the arms race or the balance of power? These questions are difficult to answer definitively because intelligence operations, by their nature, involve subtle influences rather than direct causation. What can be said with certainty is that Walker's espionage represented one of the most successful penetrations of U.S. military security during the Cold War era. Soviet intelligence gained access to information they had sought for years. They gained understanding of U.S. capabilities and intentions that informed their own strategic planning. And they gained this advantage over a period of nearly 2 decades, long enough to affect multiple generations of weapons systems and operational doctrines. The human cost of Walker's espionage extended far beyond the strategic damage. Michael Walker lost 18 years of his young adult life to federal prison for crimes he committed largely because his father manipulated him. The Walker daughters lost their father to prison and their family reputation to shame. Barbara Walker spent years bearing the guilt of having known about espionage activities and not reporting them sooner, and the additional guilt of having reported her son to authorities. Countless Navy personnel who had served in communications positions during Walker's espionage came under suspicion and faced career-damaging investigations even though they had done nothing wrong. And the Navy as an institution suffered damage to its reputation and to the trust that is essential for military operations. The Walker case also highlighted troubling questions about how espionage is punished and prevented in democratic societies. John Walker was able to operate for nearly 2 decades, despite numerous behavioral indicators that should have raised security concerns. His financial difficulties, despite steady income, his drinking and personal instability, his access to classified materials combined with unexplained wealth after his retirement. The systems designed to detect insider threats failed repeatedly, not because of any single catastrophic error, but because of accumulated small failures, background investigations that were not thorough enough, financial monitoring that was too superficial, behavioral indicators that were not recognized or reported. The question of responsibility in cases like this extends beyond the individuals who actively committed espionage. John Walker chose to commit espionage, and he bears primary responsibility for that choice and its consequences. Jerry Whitworth chose to provide classified materials to Walker for 15 years, and he bears responsibility for those choices. Arthur Walker chose to provide classified documents to his brother, and he bears responsibility. Michael Walker, though manipulated by his father, still made choices to provide classified materials and bears some degree of responsibility proportional to his understanding and circumstances. But all of these individuals operated within a system that created opportunities for their actions and failed to detect them for extended periods. Security procedures that were inadequate, background investigations that were superficial, financial monitoring systems that could not detect unexplained wealth, supervisory oversight that missed behavioral warning signs. These systemic failures did not cause the espionage, but they created conditions in which it could flourish. The Walker case also raises uncomfortable questions about family loyalty and betrayal. Barbara Walker waited years before reporting her suspicions about John, struggling with competing loyalties and fears. Her daughters struggled with the knowledge that their father had been a spy and that their mother had reported him to authorities. Michael Walker struggled with anger at his father for having recruited him and with guilt about his own choices. These family dynamics, while morally complex, ultimately led to lives being destroyed and trust being permanently damaged. In the archives of the FBI's Washington field office, the surveillance photographs from the night of May 19th to 20th, 1985, remain in Walker's case file. The images show an ordinary-looking middle-aged man, slightly overweight, placing a bag near a utility pole on a dark country road. There is nothing in these photographs that reveals what was in that bag, what those documents would have told Soviet military planners, or what would happen to the families involved. The photographs capture only the surface: a man, a road, a moment. Everything else, the betrayal, the damage, the consequences, remains invisible, which is perhaps why espionage causes the kind of harm it does. The worst damage is always the damage you cannot see. John Walker was 47 years old when he was arrested. He was 77 when he died, having spent the last 29 years of his life in federal prison. In between, he lost his freedom, his relationships with his children, any claim to honor or integrity, and ultimately any hope that his life had been meaningful. He chose to betray his country for money, and in doing so, he destroyed his family, damaged his country's national security, and provided a cautionary tale about the human capacity for self-justification and moral blindness. Michael Walker was 22 years old when his father recruited him into espionage. He was 37 when he was released from prison, having spent 18 years incarcerated for choices he made largely because he trusted his father. He spent the rest of his life trying to rebuild what had been destroyed, knowing that the years lost could never be recovered, and that the trust violated could never be fully restored. The Walker spy ring operated for 17 years and 10 months, from December 1967 to May 1985. In that time, it compromised more classified information than perhaps any other espionage operation in American history. It altered the strategic balance of the Cold War. It destroyed a family. And it served as a stark reminder that national security is ultimately dependent not on technological systems or organizational structures, but on individuals making choices, and that those choices, for good or ill, have consequences that ripple outward through time in ways that cannot always be predicted or controlled.